For over a decade, China, under President Xi Jinping, has poured billions into modernizing its military. The goal? To ascend to the ranks of a global military superpower and compete directly with the current dominant force in the world, none other than the United States. This possibility of conflict between these two giants has become a serious topic of discussion among policymakers, scholars, and the international community. It's a scenario that has sparked a lot of interest and has been analyzed from many angles. So, in today's video, we're diving into a speculative scenario of what a war between the US and China might look like. But before we get into it, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on any of our future videos. Join us as we explore fascinating and insightful topics on military affairs and geopolitics, all from the comfort of your screen. Now let's get started. China's top leaders gather in Beijing to assess the situation as the conflict looms. They have around 500 nuclear warheads at their disposal, a vast navy with 730 ships, and an air force boasting over 3,000 aircraft. Their standing army exceeds 2 million troops, making it the largest in the world. However, sheer firepower alone isn't enough to take on the United States. The People's Liberation Army, PLA, would need a more sophisticated strategy to stand a chance against the world's leading military power. The PLA must carefully organize and coordinate attacks across the Pacific as the US maintains a strong military presence in the region. With over 190 bases in South Korea and Japan alone, and a smaller but far more experienced and powerful navy, any direct assault on the US without meticulous planning and preparation would be suicidal. So what's the first move the PLA, People's Liberation Army, would need to make before launching a full-scale war? It's simple. They'd have to gain control over the Pacific, but don't expect this to start with missiles, jets, or warships. Instead, the first battlefront would likely unfold in cyberspace. For years, China has been developing the technology to infiltrate the US military's infrastructure and defense systems, aiming to cripple Washington's ability to respond swiftly to an attack. Back in 2021, a Chinese hacking group known as Volt Typhoon targeted critical infrastructure in Washington and other parts of the US. Their mission was to infiltrate and maintain covert access to these networks, evading detection for as long as possible. By December 2023, the FBI had managed to disable some of these intrusions and prevent Chinese hackers from reconnecting to their malicious networks. But this victory was only temporary. Beijing is unlikely to back down. When the order is given, Chinese hackers are expected to launch a massive wave of cyber attacks targeting the US's water supply systems, electrical grid, and communication networks, especially those near key military bases. And it doesn't stop there. They'd also go after the networks of companies providing critical services to the US military, as well as the transportation systems that America would rely on to send aid to Taiwan, should China decide to make a move across the strait. In Beijing's eyes, Taiwan isn't just a rebellious territory that needs to be reclaimed. It's the weakest link in the first island chain, a critical line of defense in the Pacific. If China wants to break through this barrier, reach the Pacific, and open a path to strike the US mainland, capturing Taiwan is a must. On the first day, in the very first hour, America would be shaken to its core. Although the US is no stranger to Chinese hackers, having successfully countered Volt Typhoon in the past, nothing could prepare them for the sheer scale of the cyber attacks unleashed now. Railroads, public transit, maritime routes, water supplies, and energy pipelines all come under fire. As America scrambles to identify the perpetrators, China seizes the opportunity to move to the next phase of its attack. With the green light from the chairman of the Central Military Commission, the PLA rocket force would immediately launch short-range missiles, while squadrons of J-16 fighters take off from Longqing, Zhangzhou, and Hui'an bases to strike Taiwan. Meanwhile, more intense strikes would be reserved for the US Pacific Fleet, a formidable force of around 200 ships, 1,500 aircraft, and 150,000 military and civilian personnel. This fleet controls half the Earth's surface, from the Antarctic to the Arctic Circle, and from the US West Coast to the Indian Ocean. It stands as the biggest obstacle to Beijing's ambitions of striking the US. Of course, at this point, China can't annihilate the US Pacific Fleet. A more feasible plan would be to weaken the fleet strategically in the first hours of the conflict, reducing America's ability to respond quickly. To achieve this, China would need to launch missile strikes against three main targets. The first would be the US naval bases in Japan and South Korea. This move is incredibly risky. Any missile attack on these countries would inevitably cause significant collateral damage, likely pushing both nations, who are US allies and have tensions with China, into the conflict. However, not attacking would leave nearly 200 US military bases with over 79,000 troops ready to strike back immediately. Beijing couldn't afford such a massive risk, so Dongfeng 26 missiles would be launched at US bases in Japan and South Korea. With a range of 4,000 kilometers, these missiles can easily reach their targets. However, not all Dongfeng 26, DF-26 missiles would be launched at once. Instead, they would be alternated with shorter-range missiles, like the Dongfeng 16, DF-16. The reason is simple. The PLA needs to conserve its long-range missiles for more distant targets. Specifically, those missiles would be reserved for strikes on Andersen Air Force Base and the naval base in Guam. In addition, China would deploy its newest and most advanced missile, the Dongfeng 27, DF-27, to target Hawaii. These would form the second group of targets. The DF-27 is a missile designed to enhance the PLA's capability to neutralize threats beyond the second island chain. With hypersonic speeds, a range of up to 8,000 kilometers, and high maneuverability, it has a good chance of penetrating US ballistic missile defenses. The DF-27 is also the key weapon the PLA would rely on to strike the North American mainland. Finally, the third group of targets would be US warships in the Pacific, especially those armed with heavy weaponry and strong air defense systems that China hopes to either destroy or severely damage. Dozens of US cruisers and destroyers are stationed near the mainland coast, and while the PLA knows it can't take out all of them, the more ships it can knock out, the easier it will be for China to launch an amphibious assault on Taiwan and eventually strike US territory. If Beijing's plan went off without a hitch, there wouldn't be much of a story here. Even though China's cyber attacks would cause significant problems for the US, they wouldn't paralyze America's missile defense systems. Instead, satellites from the US Space Force's Missile Defense Support Program would quickly detect China's missile launches, giving the president enough time to organize the country's defenses. The first measure the US would implement is the deployment of ground-based interceptors, GBIs. With 44 operational systems based in the US, specifically at Fort Greely in Alaska and Vandenberg Air Force Base in California, these interceptors play a crucial role. Vandenberg Air Force Base, in particular, is tasked with defending Hawaii and acts as the primary defense line against potential Chinese missile attacks. Across the Pacific, Beijing would be closely monitoring and awaiting the impact of its initial missile strikes aimed at targets in Japan, South Korea, and Guam. With its massive missile arsenal, the PLA would overwhelm the defenses of these US bases, which house the majority of America's overseas troops. In Japan, Okinawa would be the primary target. At Kadena Air Base, missiles would target F-15 Eagles, E-3 Sentry airborne warning and control systems, and KC-135 Stratotankers, severely limiting the US immediate counterattack capabilities. China's missile assault could be seen as an initial success, potentially killing thousands of US troops. However, Beijing knows that US bases will not cease operations entirely. At this point, the PLA would not be ready for a ground invasion, which means the US Air Force would quickly rebuild its bases and reinforce its forces to continue its role in the fight against China. Nevertheless, this is not a task that can be completed overnight. Taking advantage of the period when American aircraft were not in control of the skies and providing air support, the PLA would direct its missiles at US cruisers and destroyers in the Pacific. Unlike military bases, warships are much smaller targets and highly maneuverable, making them difficult to hit. However, China's vast missile arsenal provides it with a numerical advantage. As a result, it's estimated that the PLA could sink about half of the US cruisers and several dozen destroyers. Minutes later, Chinese DF-27 missiles would approach Hawaii. The ground-based interceptors, GBIs, from California and Alaska could shoot down dozens of these missiles in the air. Despite their advanced technology, these interceptors cannot cover the entire area. Consequently, many of China's missiles would break through the defense and strike key targets, with Beijing even hoping to destroy at least a few submarines stationed in Hawaii. However, this outcome would not come to pass. Upon receiving alerts from bases in Japan, South Korea, or Guam, or even during the ongoing cyber attacks, the US Navy would order its submarines to dive and avoid enemy missiles until America is ready to retaliate. Overall, on the first day of the conflict, China would use nearly a quarter of its 4,000 missiles to devastate US bases in Asia, albeit at the cost of drawing Japan and South Korea into the fight. The US Pacific Fleet would be significantly weakened, and cyber attacks would slow America's response to China's next moves. While it's hard to claim a complete victory for China in the opening act, the initial success would be sufficient. With the US in temporary disarray due to the attacks, Beijing would then shift its focus to its primary objective, Taiwan. As mentioned earlier, China would deploy short-range missiles alongside fighter jets to target various key locations, including smaller islands surrounding Taiwan. However, these attacks would face a formidable challenge from Taiwan's integrated air defense network, which includes US-supplied Patriot systems and domestically produced Tiancong surface-to-air missiles. After 24 hours of intense bombardment, the PLA ground forces would attempt to cross the Taiwan Strait to begin their invasion. At this stage, they would encounter significant obstacles, leaving them with few viable attack options. Beyond the natural challenges such as unpredictable weather and the lack of suitable beaches for landing, the Taiwanese have long prepared a deep and effective defense strategy to counter a full-scale assault from the mainland. As soon as the missiles start flying, Taipei would issue orders to defensive positions across the island. On the eastern side, Taiwan would benefit from its rugged, forested mountain ranges, where they would position missiles, artillery, and drones to deter any approaching forces. If necessary, they could even destroy roads built into the cliffs to prevent enemy access. Taiwan would then concentrate its efforts on the western plains and coastline, the only feasible landing area. Here, they would establish a highly fortified defense system, ensuring that any troops or equipment making it to shore would be exposed to devastating anti-tank weapons and artillery fire. Furthermore, when the tide recedes, the beaches would turn into vast mudflats, significantly slowing the advance of Chinese troops and making the landing even more treacherous. With superior numbers, the PLA would eventually breach the beaches and advance into Taiwan's cities. However, the Taiwanese defenders would utilize an extensive network of caves, bunkers, support stations, and tunnels that crisscross the island. These systems would allow Taiwan to inflict significant damage and chaos on the invading forces. Moreover, these defenses would enable a sustained guerrilla warfare campaign against the PLA, plunging them into a drawn-out war of attrition that would gradually drain their physical and mental resources. This scenario is precisely what Beijing fears most. By this time, the United States would be nearly ready to retaliate against China's initial onslaught. However, before deploying its military, Washington would execute a different strategy to exploit a critical vulnerability in China's war plan: its economy. China is heavily reliant on imported goods, spending a staggering $2.56 trillion on imports in 2023 alone. Leveraging its global influence, the United States would successfully impose severe sanctions on China, severely disrupting its connections with international trade. Especially crucial partners in Europe would likely agree to cease trade with Beijing, effectively creating an economic blockade that would strangle the mainland's economy, crippling its ability to sustain the war effort. Oil, often referred to as the lifeblood of a war machine, would be particularly hard hit. China's oil imports could plummet by as much as 80%. In 2023, Russia was China's largest oil supplier, accounting for 19% of its imports. However, the remaining oil came from other countries, many of which are US allies, such as Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. Under pressure from Washington, these nations would likely suspend their oil sales to China, or be forced to resort to less overt methods of supply, further squeezing China's war capabilities. While Russia would undoubtedly assist China's war effort in any way possible, providing drone technology, artillery, missiles, personal equipment for soldiers, satellite imagery, and other tools, Beijing should not expect too much. The ongoing conflict in Ukraine shows no signs of ending soon, and the Kremlin will be cautious about risking its resources while facing its sanctions. Additionally, Moscow would avoid sending troops to support China, as doing so could escalate the US-China conflict into a global war, a scenario that would leave Russia in a position similar to Nazi Germany during World War II, fighting on two fronts. Thus, China will largely be on its own in its war against the United States. This reality is something the leaders in Zhongnanhai likely anticipated but certainly did not hope for. With an economy strangled by sanctions, China will have no choice but to defeat the United States as quickly as possible, ideally within a few months, before its resources are depleted, potentially leading to its defeat. As sanctions take effect and China's trade relations with Europe freeze, Washington's next move would be to engage with NATO allies. After all, China has directly attacked U.S. territory by launching missiles at Hawaii and U.S. military bases abroad. This situation benefits the White House for a critical reason. Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty. According to this article, an armed attack against one NATO member is considered an attack against all members. As a result, each NATO member is obligated to take necessary action, including the use of armed force, to restore and maintain the security of the North Atlantic area. In summary, China's attack has provided Washington with a perfect justification to mobilize the combined strength of 31 nations, rallying them in a massive counteroffensive centered on the Taiwan Strait. As mentioned earlier, Beijing's failure to swiftly capture Taiwan has dragged it into a prolonged war of attrition, where the PLA loses thousands of soldiers daily in futile attempts to storm the beaches. Even if they manage to penetrate the cities through sheer numbers, they will face the nightmare of urban warfare, where the defenders always have the upper hand. With China bogged down and unable to secure a quick victory in Taiwan, the US and its allies, both within and outside NATO, will have the necessary time to prepare. Their strategic offensive plan would involve the combined military might of the US, NATO countries, Japan, South Korea, and potentially other nations with grievances against China, such as Australia and India, to ensure a swift victory. It's easy to imagine a massive fleet being deployed towards the Taiwan Strait, including at least 6 US aircraft carriers currently stationed in the Pacific, along with their escort ships. Accompanying them would be the British aircraft carrier HMS Queen Elizabeth and France's Charles de Gaulle. Canada would contribute half of its frigate fleet, while Japan would deploy most of its destroyer fleet. Meanwhile, South Korea, though not directly involved in the combat, would support Washington's war effort in various ways, such as providing logistical resources for the air and naval forces. The reason for this is their need to remain vigilant against North Korea and retain their military forces in case Pyongyang decides to open a new front to support Beijing. Washington understands this and agrees that South Korea's role will be to contain North Korea, ensuring it does not get involved in the US-China conflict. By the second week of the war, the US-led coalition's fleet was crossing the Pacific, while the PLA found itself mired in a grueling battle in Taiwan. The Chinese forces were struggling to break through Taiwan's deeply entrenched defenses, moving at a much slower pace than anticipated. The infantry was taking heavy losses in urban combat, and PLA's naval and air forces were continuously harassed by the Japanese self-defense forces. This relentless pressure was pushing China's plan to quickly seize Taiwan as a foothold in the Pacific toward collapse. 2 weeks after the initial attack, the PLA and the US-led coalition finally clashed, with Taiwan as the battleground for this historic confrontation. In the opening phase, China attempted to use ballistic missiles and fighter jets equipped with anti-ship missiles to hold back the coalition fleet and prevent it from reaching the island. However, the superior firepower and combat experience of coalition aircraft, such as the F-18 Super Hornet, Eurofighter Typhoon, and Dassault Rafale, along with advanced interception systems, quickly established air superiority. They even managed to shoot down several critical PLA assets, including the Xi'an H-6 bombers, which China desperately needed for airstrikes on Taiwan. During the engagement, some Chinese missiles might have penetrated the coalition's defenses, damaging between 10 and 20 ships. However, this would be insufficient to stop the coalition fleet's advance towards the Taiwan Strait. For the PLA, the situation would worsen as the US unveiled its secret weapon, the Rapid Dragon missile system, designed to disrupt China's efforts to isolate Taiwan by sea. In recent years, the US has been testing the deployment of long-range missiles via transport aircraft. The AGM-158 JASSM, Joint Air-to-Surface Standoff Missile, with a range of over 900 kilometers, would be loaded onto pallets aboard MC-130J Commando II or C-17 Globemaster III aircraft. These missiles would then be released through the rear cargo door. Essentially, Rapid Dragon transforms a standard cargo plane into a bomber without requiring structural modifications or additional crew training, providing a quick, flexible, and cost-effective means of delivering firepower. Launching from air bases in Japan, South Korea, Guam, and Australia, the MC-130J Commando II and C-17 Globemaster III aircraft of the US-led coalition would release volleys of cruise missiles over the Taiwan Strait, serving two crucial purposes. If these missiles strike Chinese warships, their 450 kilograms warheads would easily destroy most targets. Even if they miss, the sheer volume of simultaneously launched missiles would overwhelm and confuse the missile defense systems on China's larger warships, as well as those protecting the 3 major air bases from which PLA fighter jets are deployed. Meanwhile, beneath the waves, coalition submarines would hunt down Chinese vessels with relative ease. China's submarine fleet is notorious for being loud, with only a limited number of its newest submarines being relatively quiet. Coalition attack submarines would first focus on eliminating underwater threats before swiftly turning their attention to China's surface fleet. The Taiwan Strait, with an average depth of just 60 meters, is too shallow for submarines to operate safely without being detected. However, U.S. submarines equipped with long-range anti-ship missiles would be able to strike surface targets from outside the strait, while the deep waters off Taiwan's eastern coast would provide safe havens from which they could support Taiwan's defenses against the encircling PLA forces. Simultaneously, a fierce aerial battle would unfold in the skies over Taiwan, with both sides deploying their most advanced weaponry. In general, the Allied aircraft are better equipped, and their pilots are better trained compared to the PLA Air Force. While China has its stealth fighter, the Chengdu J-20, also known as the Mighty Dragon, its stealth capabilities are significantly inferior to those of the F-35 Lightning II. Therefore, directly pitting the Chengdu J-20 against the F-35 would be unwise. Instead, the J-20 would be used to hunt down fourth-generation coalition fighters and target AWACS, Airborne Warning and Control System aircraft. By taking out AWACS, the PLA would aim to cripple the coalition's ability to effectively coordinate air operations, even against stealth fighters. As the battle intensifies, the fall of AWACS aircraft would force fighter jets to rely solely on their radars, significantly compromising their stealth capabilities. However, the coalition could use similar tactics but with superior technology, leading to the gradual depletion of China's air force. Coupled with relentless missile and bombing raids on PLA airbases near Taiwan, the coalition would slow down Chinese aerial deployments, stranding ground forces on the island as their Navy and Air Force began to falter. With coalition forces firmly holding the Taiwan Strait, they would launch a counteroffensive, landing troops on the beaches to strike the Chinese forces from behind. At this juncture, Beijing faces a grim reality, a potential loss in the war. The leaders in Zhongnanhai must consider the drastic option of deploying nuclear weapons to force the U.S. into submission or secure favorable terms. China possesses approximately 500 nuclear warheads and intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, such as the Dongfeng 5 DF-5, with a range of 13,000 kilometers, capable of reaching the U.S. mainland. However, resorting to nuclear weapons against the U.S. would inevitably provoke a similar response from Washington, leading to mutually assured destruction, an outcome too catastrophic to contemplate. Thus, maintaining China's survival and awaiting another opportunity in the future may prove to be the more rational choice. Ultimately, China might opt to withdraw its forces and declare an end to the conflict. While the PLA demonstrated it could stand toe-to-toe with the U.S. alone and might even defeat them under certain circumstances, it simply could not withstand the unified front of the U.S. and its global allies, both within and beyond NATO. Moreover, Taiwan proved far more resilient than Beijing had anticipated. On the other hand, despite gaining a significant advantage, the coalition would refrain from invading the Chinese mainland, avoiding the risk of engaging millions of troops on such vast territory, especially after enduring substantial losses. Instead, comprehensive sanctions would be imposed across economic and military sectors, leaving China crippled and ensuring it would be unable to rebuild its military to pose a threat to the U.S. again. Of course, this scenario is just one of many possible outcomes in a potential U.S.-China conflict, with much optimism on the side of the U.S., bolstered by its global partnerships and alliances. But what do you think? What could China do to prevent this chain of events? Could these outcomes be avoided? Or would the U.S. struggle to secure the necessary support from NATO and its Asian allies? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.